Hey, good people, and welcome back to our Genesis study. And we spent a bit of time last week talking about the first 2 and 3 verses, 1 to 3 verses of Genesis 1. And if you decided to tune in this week, I guess I did not scare you away, and we can continue our study on what exactly happened in the garden. Okay, so Genesis 1, we talked about there had to have been something that happened between verses 1 and 2. Now, whether I think that supports gap theory, or whether I think that supports a case for dinosaurs, whether I think that supports all kinds of things, that's neither here nor there, right? But what's important is that we understand is that God is outside of our time reference. God is not bound by what we know about time. God is not bound by what we know about what we can see in matter and in space. That the Bible is an account of what happened on earth during a specific period of time to help us be prepared for the next realm. The Bible is basic instructions before leaving earth. And so the expectation is that as the earth as we know it at some point will pass away. That's biblically backed up. We spent 30-something weeks this year and last year talking about what was to happen after this earth is to pass away. What is the process of this earth passing away? And so like I told you last week, everything that has its beginnings has its foundations and its endings, I apologize, in Revelation finds its beginning right here in Genesis, okay? It has its beginnings in Genesis. So let's pick up. We're going to pick up reading, and I've got how I'm set up today is I've got the King James Version on one side, and I've got the New Revised Standard Version on the other side. King James is the older version. It's the version most of us learned our Bible verses from. And that's why I have that version open. And then I have the New Revised Standard Version open because according to many scholars, it is the most reliable translation in English, okay? That's my only rhyme or reason. I'm not saying one version is better than the other. I'm just saying for the purposes of interpreting what God is saying to us today, I've got King James on one side and New Revised Standard Version on the other. And as I told my Sunday school class, about a year ago, maybe a little more than a year ago, is if you're going to read the Bible correctly and you don't speak Greek or Hebrew, you need more than one translation, okay? And that is I believe that. My favorite Bible has 4 versions of it. It's a parallel Bible, and it looks like it's been worn. Why? Because sometimes I may not understand King James, and sometimes the New Living Translation may make it too plain. I need to understand what is the heart of God. What is he saying to me in these moments? What was he saying to the church or to the Hebrews in that time? And how is it relevant today? So let's pick up. And I'm going to read what we read last week because it's only 2 verses. And we're going to pick up today. It says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, as it was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, and that was the first day." I think the first thing that we've got to make abundantly clear is that light did not precede God. Okay, light was not before God, and I think a lot of times we want to equate lightness with God, and we want to equate darkness with Satan. And the truth is that darkness and lightness did not come before God. God was walking around, and there was a void, and it was dark, and God was yet good. Okay, God was still God. He was still omniscient. He was still omnipotent. He still had all powerful. Still had all power. And I think what we must understand before we go any further is that when things get dark, that does not mean that God is not present. Okay, and if the Holy Spirit ain't talking to nobody, he's talking to me. When things get dark and they get dismal and they seem bleak and they are blighted, what I think we have to remember is that the darkness did not precede God, and neither did light, and that even though we like to associate light with God, God was there when it was dark and it was void. So even when the earth was in a state that it did not recognize itself in, even when the earth was in a state that was not the original intention, God was still there, and God could look in the situation and speak to the situation and cause something good to come out of a situation that seemed to be dead or void. Okay, or void. And so I think in our intimate study In our intimate and intricate study of the Word of God today, I think we have to pause and remember that just because light was created on day one, that didn't mean that God was not able. Because there was a period, as we talked about last week, that the earth was formless and it was void. Now, if I can come back on your level, let's come back to your level. There is a period in your life, maybe it's today, maybe it was a couple of years ago, maybe it'll be tomorrow, but there will be a period in your life where it would feel like things are formless and they are void. A period where it will feel like everything is falling apart. It'll feel like life is not helping. It feels like there's nothing good going on. And so your question then becomes, if life is formless and void, where is God? But God was yet there because, remember in verse 1, it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. God was present. He never got an absent mark. He never was not there. Although things went in a direction he didn't want them to, he was still there, he was still able, and he was still able to redeem. And I think whether we're talking about creation and the science of it, trying to understand the theology of it, or you're trying to say what in Genesis can speak to my life today, I think regardless we have to see that God was yet present when things were formless and when they were void. But what I love is in verse 3 he says, then God said. So God looked at the situation and he says, let there be light. And when God saw and he spoke and said, let there be light, I'm sure you can imagine, or if you spend any time in Sunday school or in Bible study, you see that when God said, let there be light, light became a thing. The earth in its present state knew nothing of light. Knew nothing of light. And light is an estrogen. It cleans. It cleanses. It sheds insight to things. There was no insight. There was no eyesight. There were none of these things existed on the earth, but God walked into the situation. He began to create. He says, let there be light. And when he looks at it and he says, let there be light, light becomes a thing. And what I want you to see is that when he looks at it, he says, let there be light. And he looks at the light and he says, it's good. Now, why is this good? Why? He looks at it, he says it's good because you got to remember he's creating out of a place that is formless and is void. So he's creating from a place. He's taking a place that is formless and it is void or it is bad. And he is breathing the breath of lives. He is speaking and breathing go coincide. They go in together. He's breathing, and as he speaks, he takes a bad thing and he makes it good. Simply because God put his cosign on it. God said, I'm going to bring it into order. He says, let there be light. And out of void and darkness, things that God says I didn't create in. This wasn't my initial intent, but I'm about to bring it back into order. Remember, you got to go back to last week to understand where I'm going. He said, I didn't create in chaos. I didn't create out of form. I didn't create out of void. But because I didn't create out of form and I didn't create out of void, I want you all to understand that when I speak, let there be light, light will become a thing. And maybe I just needed to preach myself happy today. Maybe I just needed to encourage myself because I'm having a rough day. The truth is that God at any moment can speak into a formless and a void situation and say, let there be light. Now, I think God speaks light into the situation because light brings about clarity. And if you're in a formless and a void situation, the first thing you need is clarity. Because if you're in a formless and a void situation, you continually go in circles. Okay, you'll continuously stay in a void and a formless situation. If you're continually in a situation that is so dark and dismal and it seems like everything is in dysfunction, because that's what the earth is basically in. The earth is formless and it's void. The earth is in dysfunction. The earth is in dysfunction. God didn't create it in dysfunction, but at this point it's in dysfunction. And so God speaks, let there be light. So the first thing he does, he gives clarity. He opens it up. He says, well, let's open the windows. Let's see something. Let's see what we're working with. I think we have to do that. We have to do that whether you're going to build a house, whether you're trying to get things in order. The first thing you got to do is you got to be able to see something. You got to bring about some clarity. So you got to open some wounds. You've got to deal with some things. So he says, let there be light. That's the first thing he does, because first thing you need to do is you need to be able to see. Because what good is it if I'm going to go and create amazing, miraculous things if people can't see them? What good does it do if I bring the entire earth into order and I can't see them? And nobody can see them. You remember last week I told you about how Job and God kind of got into a tussle, and God says, were you there when I was forming the earth, and I laid the plumb line, and I did the dimensions, and I laid the cornerstone of the earth? He says, were you there? He said, while the angels worshiped me. And so light, they can't worship something they can't see. And I know that sounds crazy, right? Because you're like, I can't see God. How do I worship something I can't see? You may not be able to see God, but you can see the evidence of God. And so he says, you got to be able to see the evidence of what I'm doing. And so he says, let there be light. And he says, light was good. And I think it's paramount that God says light was good, because God is now speaking. He's speaking into a dead, dismal situation. He says it's good because there is none good but God. And so if it's good, he's saying, I'm taking it, I'm transforming it from void and formlessness, and I'm putting life into it. I'm breathing something fresh into it, so that if something fresh gets in it, maybe it's worthy of my seal. So he says it is good. He says, let there be light. And it was good. And then God saw the light, and it was good. He separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day and the darkness night. And there was evening and there was morning, and that was the first day. I want you to also see this. Is not only does he separate the light from the day, the light from the darkness, and he calls one day and one night. He separates the two. He makes sure that he begins to put a system in place. And he says on the first day there was then morning and evening. There was now daytime and evening time. He begins to put in order. Because God is taking out of formless and out of void. He's saying, well, this is a dysfunctional mess. Let me call it into order. Now that I've got clarity, now that you can see some things, let's go ahead and begin to put a system in place. And as I begin to order a system in place, now we can work. I don't know about you, but Genesis begins to give me some insight on how to fix my life. Genesis begins to give me some insight on how to fix an organization. Genesis begins to give me some insight on how do we build when we don't know how to build. How do we get out of a place that seems like it's dysfunctional and get functional? Because the first thing he does, he says, let there be light. He gives us clarity. Then he separates the light from the darkness. So now that we can see the clarity, now let's separate the stuff that we can see so far so that we can begin to move forward for the next day. And then he runs the system on the first realm. Now, we're about to go through 6 more days, really 5, but it's technically 6 more days worth of building. I want you to see what God does here in day 1, because he runs the day and the night in the first day. He takes it and he says, okay, this is how I want this to work. And he causes it to revolve. He says day and night is separate, and he says in the first day there was day and there was night. If you were to be reorganizing an organization, or you were to be reorganizing your family, or you were trying to work on your marriage, this is how the Word of God can help you, because this is revelation here. He says if you were to be working on any of these things, the first thing that you got to do is, once you get some clarity, after you get some clarity, you got to run the new systems that you've been working on. And what I want you to see is he's got these things separated out in 6 more days. You can't build Rome in a day. Now, it's amazing God creates the heavens and the earth in a day, in seven. But even God spaced out some things to give things an opportunity to work. Because God understood if you gave everything an opportunity to work, if you gave it an opportunity to work, then you could see what the kinks are. Now, God looks at light and he says it's a good thing. But if you were to apply the God method, I hope I'm not losing you, but if you were to apply the God method, you've got to say, all right, now, what do we do from here? After we've run this and it's been successful. This is how the Bible can help you run your business. This is how the Bible can help you run your day. There are mysteries embedded here in the scriptures, not just for my knowledge. I can read about Genesis all day long. having understanding, fundamental knowledge about how the earth came into being, cool beans. But how does that help me today? All right. All right, let's keep going. Let's keep going. Then he says, and then God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So God made a dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it is so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning and the second day. Now, let's just read it. Let's read it that in the King James. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and it divided the waters that were the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. Now, in case you were having a curious moment, you're like, how do I read the Bible? How do I read the Bible? I don't know. How do I read the Bible? We've got to ask this question here, right? Because the King James says, and God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were called the second day. The New Revised Standard Version says God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning, and that was the second day. Now, let's read another version. The NIV says, and let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water. And so God made the vault and separated the water from under the vault and the water from above it. And it was so. And he called the vault sky. And there was evening, and there was the morning, and the morning was the second day. Now, that makes me ask the question, though, which one are we talking about? Now, the Hebrew would suggest we're talking about the sky. We believe the heavens are in a different realm. Now, I think it is from that version that we often find ourselves confused, because a lot of people were like, well, heaven is up in the sky. And I guess in a way that we could translate, we could say that. You could say that. But you're not going to go, we've got this billionaire space race going on right now. The year is 2021, in case somebody watches this in 50 years. The year is 2021. We got this billionaire space race where you got all these billionaires who are trying to race to get to space. They're getting to Mars. And so they're building the biggest and best spaceships to try to race to get to Mars, thinking that they can go and build civilization on Mars because we're, at some point going to destroy the Earth. That's what a lot of folks, that's what they believe, right? And so you got all these billionaires who are racing to get up there. And as they're racing to get up there and to do all this stuff, what we see is that I believe, and this is just a discourse that I'm going to take, I believe you got a lot of billionaires who don't know Christ, and they're trying to find out God. And it sounds a lot like the Tower of Babel. Okay, it sounds like the Tower of Babel, and in about 5, 6, 7, 8 chapters, around chapter 9, we'll talk about the Tower of Babel. But in a nutshell, what it sounds like is they're trying to find out, is there more to life outside of the earth that we know, as if earth was not enough for the asking, okay? And so you got all these folks that are chasing knowledge, they're trying to chase and try to figure out what's going on up in the sky, as if heaven were attainable or reachable by man without spiritual influence. There is a reason that Enoch was taken, and we're going to talk about that too in a few weeks. Enoch was taken. And as Enoch was taken, it was that when he was taken by spirit, by God. God takes him. God reaches out of a different realm and grabs Enoch and takes him with him. And so I think when we talk about here in Genesis, the word here that we're talking about, the firmament and God creating the sky or the heavens, we're not talking about heaven, the place, we're talking about the sky. The sky. All right, I hope that made sense. And verse, let's see. Well, let's keep reading. And it says, and let there be a vault between the waters to separate the water from the water. And so God made the vault to separate the water from the water and the water above it. And it was so. And God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and the morning and the evening, that was the second day. Verse 9. And God said, let there be water under the sky to be gathered to one place, and let the dry ground appear. And it was so. And God called the dry ground land, and he gathered waters, and he called seas. And God saw it, and that was good. So what I want you to see is each day, little by little, God is calling into order the major players on earth. So he hangs the sky, all right? The next day after he hangs, first he creates light. He separates light from darkness. He puts in a cycle so that at one point in the day it'll be light, next part of the day it'll be dark, so that when the animals come days later, when men and women come days later, that there is a system in place for man to be able to go to sleep and to wake up. And so it creates a circadian rhythm in the earth. Now, a circadian rhythm is the rhythm by which we naturally go to sleep and wake up. And so if you ever notice that we are created as humans if we were ever to watch the sunrise, it wakes you up. I used to love driving from Auburn to Birmingham on Sunday mornings, because if I got on the road at like 5:30, it was dark, but I would watch the sun progressively rise. And it seemed like as it rose, the more it rose, the more I felt. Like the better I felt. And I began to wake up. And as I began to wake up, by the time the sun was fully in the sky, I was wide awake. And then if I ever watched the sunset, I would watch the sunset, and slowly but surely I would begin to get sleepy. And as I began to get sleepy, it would be time to go to sleep. That is our natural circadian rhythm. And what God is doing in the beginning, as he's calling the creation out of formlessness, out of dysfunction, he's creating these things. So he's creating the circadian rhythm. The earth is getting the circadian rhythm. And so before he ever plants a tree, before he ever calls a blade of grass, before he ever creates an animal, before he calls Adam to be, or he pulls Eve out of her, he creates in the earth a system so that everything else can coexist within the system that he's creating. Okay? So he creates the sky, and then he creates the land. He separates the land from the seas. And when he separates the land from the seas, he's now creating form. Because remember, it was formless and it was void. He's creating form. He's creating order so that when the people come, when the animals come, when the trees come, there is a place that can host them. Okay? And I think that's also a thing, that God begins to do that in our lives when he gets ready to bless us. He begins to put things in place so that we can host the blessings that we're calling. If God is calling you to start a business, he begins to give you insight and knowledge on the very thing that business is going to be. He begins to give you insight. Now, whether you accept it, reject it, run from it, say I don't need it, that's between you and him. But he begins to put people in place so that you can accept and receive the very thing that he's given. Now, then he says, then God said, let the land produce vegetation. All right, so after there's water, after there's ground, then he allows the plants to come to be. I want you to see how God is doing this in order. You get light, you get night. You get light, you get day, and you get night. Then after you get light and you get day and you get night, then God calls the skies to come. Then after he calls the sky into being, then he separates the firmament, so then he lays the ground. And he calls the seas into being. So now we got water, we got vegetation. So after we got water, we got ground, so we got dirt. Now we got a place that plants can thrive. Okay? We've got all the things that we need. We've got a sun hung up in the sky. We got all the things we need. And then he says, let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants, and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. I want you to see this. God says, let the land produce vegetation. Now, I like how the New Revised, the NIV says that. And let's read the King James real quick first. 11, he says, And he says, and God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is it upon itself upon the earth. And it was so. What I love here is that at this point, God has stopped saying, let there be to it, and it just happens. Now he says, let the land that I've created yield forth the things that I've given it the ability to do. All right, I hope y'all caught that. He says, let there be light. There was nothing to produce light at that point, and so there was nothing he could just say, cool. So he says, let there be light. Then he hangs the sky, because there's nothing that can create sky. He hangs the sky, and then he says, separate the firmament from the waters, and now they're a thing. Now that there is a place, there's a sun, there's ground, there's water. Now he says, now the things that I've created, do what I've created you to do. He says, let the land bring forth vegetation. Okay? I hope you're following me. He says, let the land bring forth vegetation. And he even speaks to the land what kind of vegetation to bring forth. He says, don't produce stuff that can't reproduce. Don't produce anything that can't reproduce, because I'm not in the business of having to tend to you forever. I'm going to put you on autopilot because I've given you everything you need to stay in existence until I decide to stop you. So what does he do? He said he lays the firmament, he lays the ground, and he speaks to it. This is the God method. God brings things into we're going to see it all throughout the Bible. He brings things into existence. And then after he brings them into existence, he gives you the tools you need to reproduce, to grow, and to thrive. And after he gives you the tools you need to reproduce, to grow, and to thrive, that's what he expects you to do. And so if God were to whisper into you and to breathe into you gifts to bless the kingdom of God, it is not that God wants you to sit there and say, God, spoon feed me. God said, I gave you gifts, talents, and all kind of stuff. It's not that if God gave you a great gift of carpentry, God says, I gave you trees. I gave you hands. I gave you the gift. Now, whether you want to go be a great builder, or you want to build furniture, or you want to be a remodeler, or whatever it is, I have given you. The earth has yielded to you everything that you need to do what you need to do. Can I submit to you? God has given you everything you need. He's given you everything you need, and everything that you don't have, he's bringing so that you have everything that you need to build according to how he's called you to build. Because there's a shifting point. There's a shifting point where he goes from let there be to he says, allow the land to produce. I made the land so that it could host production. I created a great manufacturer and let it create all kind of fruit. Let it bring forth yields, seed-bearing fruit, seed-bearing vegetation. And that's the other thing that we must remember, is that God is always looking for your seed. And I'm not talking about your tithe and offering. This is not an offertory appeal. But God wants to know, are you going to plant a seed, or are you going to toil all your life? A lot of us, and I don't have kids, and so I'm going to tread lightly. A lot of us don't realize that we plant seeds in our kids, but they're bad seeds. And so we're always teaching them how to do, not to do. We're teaching them that they aren't good, and we get mad when the bad qualities sprout up. On the other side of things, we got people who are sowing wonderful seeds into their kids. And as a result, those kids become productive. Those kids have all kinds of tools. They have good, strong self-esteem. But what will happen, what continues to happen over and over and over and over and over again, is we sow seeds into situations, and they're bad seeds. God is saying, let's get some seed sowing going, some good seed, and put some good seed in the ground. Because if you let the earth bring forth your stuff, so if you let so-and-so bring forth the stuff I put in her, it will be good. But if she chooses to use bad seed, or she chooses to use some stuff that's not going to produce the way that I called it to be, that's on her. I hope I'm making sense. I'm going to move on. That was the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and serve as signs to mark sacred times, days, and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on earth. And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. So then God hangs the sun, the moon, and the stars. Okay? Basically, that's what it's saying. He hangs the sun, the moon, and the stars. I want you to see what's happening. He created an atmosphere so that vegetation can happen. If we read this on the surface, we could say, okay, God hung the sun, the moon, and the stars. But God then creates time. Okay? Let's read the verse again. He then creates time. Now, God lives outside of time. God is not bound by time. God doesn't have to obey time. God doesn't even have to hopscotch in or out of time to get stuff done, because time is a mechanism by which God created, okay? But God here on the fourth day creates time. He says, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. God creates time. He creates time. He says, all right, the people and the animals will need to know when the seasons change. They'll also need the stars to tell them what to do, how to get where they're going, and all of these things. And so since they need these markings, I'm going to give them to them. So he creates time. And then God said it was good. And I want to make sure you understand this. After God does any of these things, he says it's good. Because he's creating out of the essence of who he is. And so since God doesn't need a rhythm to determine what he does next, because it's his plan, he creates time so that we can keep a marker on what God did and how God did it. And so even, I'm going to go here, right? And this might upset some people. God creates time on the fourth day. God creates time on the fourth day. Days are a mechanism of time. Okay? Hope you follow me. Days are a mechanism of time. The only reason it talks about God creating the heavens and the earth in 7 days was to give us a reference point to what God did. God was not bound by the time, okay? And so while there are a lot of good people who hold fast to this, they say, well, the earth was created here. The earth was created there. We believe that God created the earth in 7 24-hour periods. Or we believe God did it over spans of thousands of years. God is not bound by time because God created time, and he doesn't create time until the fourth day. And he creates time for us. Okay? So whether God created the heavens and the earth over a span of thousands of years, but because God isn't bound by time, it created like that, or he created in some 24-hour spans, it doesn't matter because God is not bound by time, and time is created on the fourth day. That's for free. And I'm going to leave it right there. I'm trying to get you out of your religiosity in reading the word, and I want you to really read it in awe of how big God is. Okay? I want us to read the word in awe of how big God is, because a lot of times we don't look at how big God is, and we want to confine him to the words on a page, when often those words on the page are there to help us understand God in our little bitty minds. So let me take a sidebar. George Washington Carver, Black history hero. A lot of us know. George Washington Carver, the guy who was responsible for the peanut butter and peanut oil and peanut everything, and also a lot of sweet potato stuff. A lot of people don't know that. George Washington Carver was a devoutly religious guy, but not was he just religious, he was relational. So George Washington Carver would get up before the break of day every morning, and he would walk and talk with God outside. And as he would get up and he would walk and talk with God, he would ask God questions. And as he would walk and talk with God, there was one morning George got up. He said, God, can you tell me why you created the universe? And because George and God were intimate, God says, that's too big for you. George asks the next morning, he says, God, can you tell me why you created the earth? And God says, that's too big for you. Smaller, smaller, smaller. He says, God, tell me why you created the forest. Explain to me, why is it you created the forest? Why? And he says, George, smaller, 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 smaller. And one day, finally, George asks God, he says, well, God, why did you create the peanut? And he says, go back to your lab, George, and I will show you why I created the peanut. And George was then responsible for hundreds of things that the peanut could do. Often God, in what we read here in the Bible, is encapsulated just the small things about him to give us an inkling or an understanding. It seems vast and large and huge to us, but God is trying to give us an understanding of just how big God is, just how profound God is. And so I think when we try to tie God down to make him fit into our understanding and the rules and the things that he created just for us so that we would not fall out and go crazy, I think we make God smaller because the Bible can't be your God. If the Bible is your God is way too small. The Bible teaches me about my God, okay? The Bible teaches me about my God, but if at any point the Bible becomes your God, we have a problem, okay? Let's keep going. Let's keep going. Verse 20. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living thing with which water teems and that it moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, and he said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, and it was the fifth day. So God begins to create the animals. Now, I want you to see what's happening. As God starts out putting the basic building blocks of life into fashion. Okay, this is science class. Fun, right? He puts the basic building blocks into earth. All right, as he brings light into being, he causes the sky to fall. Then he puts the ground. He creates water. He creates stuff that can begin to thrive. Now we can allow vegetation for plants and for trees and to weeds. So now we have carbon dioxide and oxygen in the atmosphere, and now the earth has an exchange that it can make, right? And so then he creates fish of the sea and great creatures, large creatures, small creatures. He creates birds that can fly and fish that can swim. And he creates animals that can roam. He creates livestock and all kinds of stuff that can roam. And he creates a hierarchy. And that's what we're missing here in day 5. He creates a hierarchy so that the earth is still self-supporting. So that it's still self-supporting. You've got meat, you've got vegetables, you've got animals that you have mosquitoes that have a purpose, you have roaches that have a purpose, you have the trees that have a purpose, you have collard green plants, and you have cabbage plants, you have everything has a purpose. God has divinely put things in order so that everything can self-support, and that he doesn't introduce anything until it's still self-supporting. So the animals couldn't come until the vegetation was there because they would need something to graze on. The vegetation couldn't come before the ground and the sun or the light because it needed something for photosynthesis. Oh, science class. It had to be able to be self-supporting. When he created the vegetation, he said you would need to be seed-bearing and yielding so that you can still recreate and reproduce. Because we're dealing with an earth that was, when it was made void, and when it was formless and void, it could not recreate itself. It was dependent on God. And God said, I'm going to create on the earth so that you can recreate yourself. All right. Then he says, then day 6 happens, and something happens. And he says, then God says, let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. And so God created mankind in his own image, In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Then God said, let me read it again. Let us make. Now, we've been talking about God up until this point as a singular, as one. Up until this point, we've been talking about God as singular up until this point. And then here we arrive today at day 6, and then it says, let us create. We see a shift because God did this, and God did that, and God did this, and God did that, and God did this, and God did that, and God did this. And then it says, and then let us make mankind. Well, man in the King James, in the NIV, in the New Revised Standard Version, it says, make mankind after our image. Because God is in 3 persons. And early in Genesis 1, God being in 3 persons is introduced. We see it hinted about in the Old Testament. It is on display in the New Testament. But even in Genesis, again, everything that God has finished in the New Testament gets its beginning in the Old Testament. He says, let us make mankind in our image and in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the life. So let us, God, the ruling God. Remember Elohim, in the beginning, God, Elohim, the living God, created the heavens and the earth. So now he has created a self-supporting earth. He's created an ecosystem that can function on its own. And as he has created it, he says, now let us create man in our image and in our likeness. Let us create man in our image and in our likeness. So let's think about this. Now, again, best commentary on the Bible is the Bible, right? Let's think about this. You've got God the Father, creator, perpetuator of all things, having a conference call with God the Son and with the Holy Spirit. God the weighty one, creator God. God, the compassionate one, the fleshy God. Not fleshy, but you know. And in the Spirit, let us create in our image and our likeness. And what I want you to see is, the King James is probably, for once, a better translation, because it says, let us create man. Because at this point, it only creates man. He creates man in our likeness, in our image. He's creating man. And the womb man, the woman on the inside of man, because she's not been pulled out of him yet. And he says, in our likeness, in our image. Now, what we're going to talk about when we get to later chapters is why it was important that man had to come out of her, a woman had to come out of him, because the likeness and the image of God was going to be a stumbling block. But we were still created in his likeness and his image because we were his handiwork, but so was the earth. Not only were we his handiwork, but we were his child. All of this was for us. And so now we have reached day 6. And he says, let them create him. Let us create man in our likeness and in our image. And in the image, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God said to them, let be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over every living creature that on the ground moves. Then God says, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. To all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that is the breath of life in it, I give you every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw that he had made all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, and it was the sixth day. Mankind was a child. See, the animals were cool. They were great. The skies being put up in the sky, the firmament and the seas were wonderful. All of these things were good. But when he made man, he said, I give it all to you. I did it all for you. You remember at the end of the series in Revelation, I said, why did God do it? Why did God do it if he knew that we were going to mess up? Why did God do it? And he did it to display love. And here at the end of chapter 1 of the Bible, not just Genesis, but of the Bible, here at the beginning of chapter 1. I remember I asked you at the end of last chapter of 22 in Revelation, the end of the Bible, I asked you, why did he do it? And he did it because when he saw us, it was like a parent looking in the eyes of his child for the very first time. And he said, for you, I'll give you everything. You love me, serve me, and I'll give you everything. Everything you could ever imagine. I'll create it in its perfection. I'll set you up, make sure that you have everything, and I'll give it to you because I love you. And I will show you no better example of what love should be, could be, would be, and has been. Yes, the earth was formless and it was void. I had to recreate, but I would do it all over for you because I love you. And so we begin to see that story played out. And that is the Bible record. We see that story played out because in just 2 chapters, it all falls apart. It all falls apart. And so next week, we will pick up in chapter 2. And I'm going to go more into depth about this man-child that gets created. This man-child with whom he hands everything. He hands everything as an inheritance. One thing that you're going to see throughout the Bible is there's a lot of weight placed on the inheritance. And it's typology of God showing us how much our inheritance in him is. And we see it throughout the whole Bible because all he was trying to do was give us an inheritance on the front end, and we messed it up. And so he displays for us how much he cares for us in creation. Because he didn't just throw us in a formless void earth and say, hey, fend for yourself. He builds with craftsmanship. He rebuilds with craftsmanship. He makes sure that everything is in order. He prepares a place. He prepares a place for us. And all of these themes that I'm pulling out, all of these themes are throughout the entire canon of Scripture until the end. He prepares a place, a perfect place for his kids. And I'm just grateful I'm one of them. So I will see you guys next week. I hope you're enjoying. Feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. You all be blessed.